The smallest act of arrogance can destroy the biggest empire. I didn't understand how true those words were until I heard the shriek of metal echo across my ranch before sunrise. The cold October air carried the smell of fresh-cut cedar and diesel fuel long before I reached the north pasture. My boots crunched across frozen gravel as the first lights spilled over the hills. Then I saw it. My barn gates were gone. Thick oak gates that had stood there for nearly 40 years had been ripped from their hinges and tossed into the grass like they were worthless scrap. The heavy steel posts leaned at awkward angles. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt. Beyond them, hundreds of acres of open prairie stretched toward the neighboring golf course that had become the pride of Blackstone Ridge HOA. My name is Nathan Brooks. Most people around here think I'm just another rancher who inherited old land that time forgot. They see faded jeans, dusty boots, and a weathered pickup truck. They never bother asking why someone who supposedly struggles to maintain a ranch owns nearly 6,000 acres bordering one of the fastest-growing luxury developments in Texas. They certainly never ask why my property has remained untouched while every surrounding ranch disappeared beneath million-dollar homes and perfectly trimmed fairways. The answer is simple. I never felt the need to explain myself. Especially not to people who mistake silence for weakness. The wind carried a strange silence that morning. Usually my American bison stayed calm before breakfast. Their low grunts drifted across the pasture like distant thunder. That morning I heard restless movement instead. Hooves shifted against dry earth. Massive shadows wandered closer to the missing entrance. They weren't escaping yet. But they were confused. And confused bison are something no experienced rancher ever ignores. Then I noticed a bright white sign hammered into the ground beside the broken posts. Property Beautification Initiative. Authorized by Blackstone Ridge Homeowners Association. Community Appearance Committee. Someone had actually left their paperwork behind as if destroying private ranch infrastructure was part of a landscaping project. I bent down and picked up the laminated notice. The paper still smelled like fresh printer ink. Across the valley, morning sprinklers hissed across emerald fairways. Golf carts rolled quietly between perfectly shaped bunkers. Expensive homes reflected the sunrise through walls of polished glass. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked carefully planned. Almost beautiful. Almost permanent. I slipped the notice into my jacket pocket without saying a word. My neighbor Wade pulled his truck onto the dirt road and stared at the empty gate opening. He asked if I wanted him to call the sheriff. I shook my head. Not yet. Some mistakes become far more expensive when you let the people responsible believe they've already won. Wade looked toward the pasture. I followed his eyes. Nearly 300 bison slowly turned together. Their attention settled on the wide opening where the gates used to stand. Beyond that opening waited manicured grass worth millions of dollars. Beyond that opening waited a community that believed appearances mattered more than property rights. They thought they had removed an ugly gate. They had no idea they had unlocked the first step toward a disaster that would bankrupt an entire neighborhood before anyone understood who truly owned the ground beneath their feet. Nobody in Blackstone Ridge knew much about me because I worked hard to keep it that way. Around town I was simply Nathan Brooks. The quiet rancher at the end of the county road. The guy who bought feed in bulk. The man who always waved first but rarely stayed long enough for small talk. That reputation suited me just fine. My grandfather purchased this ranch in 1958 with money he earned repairing farm equipment after returning from the Korean War. He believed land should outlive the people who cared for it. My father expanded the operation one pasture at a time. He never borrowed more money than he could repay before harvest. He used to tell me that fences kept neighbors honest. Gates kept livestock safe. Paperwork kept lawyers employed. I smiled every time I remembered him saying that. I inherited the ranch 12 years ago after losing both of my parents within 18 months of each other. The grief settled slowly. The work never stopped. Every sunrise demanded the same routine. Feed inspections. Water lines. Fence repairs. Veterinary records. Thousands of details that nobody visiting from the city ever noticed. The bison were never simply livestock to me. They were part of a conservation breeding program that my family had supported for decades. Every calf carried documented bloodlines. Every animal was tagged, monitored, and protected under agreements that most people would never think to read. Visitors often expected angry monsters with horns. What they found instead were intelligent animals that respected routine better than many humans. Break that routine and everything changed. That was why the missing gates bothered me far beyond the cost of replacing timber and steel. Gates controlled movement. Movement controlled behavior. Behavior kept 300 powerful animals calm without a single raised voice. Most people looked at my ranch and saw old barns surrounded by open grass. I looked across those same fields and saw generations of planning. Every pasture had a purpose. Every fenced line guided seasonal migration between grazing sections. Every water tank sat exactly where it needed to be. Nothing existed by accident. That included the barn gates someone had decided were ugly enough to remove. Blackstone Ridge had arrived only 6 years earlier. Before that, the hills beyond my northern fence held mesquite trees, cattle pasture, and one abandoned gravel road. Then developers discovered the valley. Bulldozers replaced bluebonnets. Luxury homes appeared almost overnight. The golf course became the centerpiece of glossy advertisements promising peaceful country living with modern elegance. They sold a dream built beside a working ranch. Somehow the buyers loved the scenery but hated the ranch that created it. Complaints started almost immediately. They disliked the smell after heavy rain. They disliked ranch trucks using the county road before sunrise. They disliked hearing bison during breeding season. They disliked hay deliveries because the trailers collected dust. Every month, someone new arrived expecting the countryside to behave like a private resort. I usually ignored them. Nature never asked permission to exist. That simple truth frustrated people who believed enough money could redesign reality. Then Victoria Langford became president of the Homeowners Association. She treated every board meeting like a corporate takeover. She spoke with polished confidence that impressed people who confused confidence with competence. She loved words like improvement, compliance, modernization, community standards. She smiled often, but it never reached her eyes. I met her only twice before that morning. Both conversations lasted less than 5 minutes. Both ended with her reminding me that progress always required compromise. I simply thanked her for stopping by and returned to work. Looking back now, I think that irritated her more than any argument ever could. Some people cannot stand being ignored. They need every conversation to end with surrender. Victoria believed she was expanding a beautiful neighborhood. She never realized she was slowly stepping into a world that had been operating successfully long before her first luxury home ever stood on those hills. Victoria Langford never yelled. That was what made her dangerous. She spoke with the smooth confidence of someone who believed every room already belonged to her. The first time she visited my ranch, she stepped out of a spotless white luxury sport utility vehicle without looking at the muddy ground beneath her shoes. The scent of expensive perfume drifted across the pasture and mixed with fresh hay in a way that felt completely out of place. She glanced at my weathered barn before she even introduced herself. Then she smiled the same polished smile I had seen at county meetings. She told me Blackstone Ridge was becoming one of the most desirable communities in the state. She said property values were climbing every quarter. She explained that investors were watching the neighborhood closely. Then she looked directly at my barn gates and said they ruined the entrance view for golfers approaching the 7th fairway. I thought she was joking. I even laughed quietly. She did not. She handed me a glossy brochure showing digital renderings of future improvements. Decorative stone walls, imported trees, walking trails, luxury event spaces. Every picture carefully avoided showing my ranch. She suggested replacing my traditional wooden gates with something more elegant. She even offered the names of contractors approved by the Homeowners Association. I thanked her for the suggestion and politely declined. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, she folded the brochure with slow, deliberate movements, and told me that communities evolved whether people wanted them to or not. After that day, the letters began arriving. Every envelope carried the same clean logo across the top. They claimed my barn reduced neighborhood appeal. They complained about equipment visible from the county road. They objected to the natural color of my fencing because it looked old compared to the decorative entrances surrounding the subdivision. Each complaint sounded more absurd than the last. I filed every letter inside a cabinet beside decades of ranch records. I never responded. Silence frustrated Victoria far more than disagreement ever could. She expected resistance. She expected negotiations. She expected me to ask permission. Instead, I kept repairing fences, feeding bison, maintaining water systems, living exactly as I always had. A few weeks later, I drove into town for hardware supplies. The cashier asked if I had heard the latest rumor. According to several homeowners, I planned to sell my ranch because the Homeowners Association had already reached an agreement with me. I almost laughed again. No one had ever asked whether I intended to sell. They simply assumed enough money could solve every problem. On my way home, I noticed fresh survey flags along the edge of the golf course. Bright orange markers stood only a few feet from my fence line. They had appeared overnight. The county records showed no approved boundary changes. I photographed every flag, removing nothing. Documentation mattered more than emotions. 2 mornings later, I found workers measuring near my entrance while wearing shirts with the Homeowners Association logo. They smiled politely and claimed they were gathering information for future landscaping. One of them casually mentioned that the front gates would probably disappear eventually because they interrupted the visual flow of the neighborhood. I asked who had authorized the inspection. He looked uncomfortable and admitted the instructions came directly from Victoria. I thanked him for his honesty and wished them a safe day. As they drove away, I noticed one of the workers glance back at the pasture. Even from a distance, he understood something his employer did not. Those gates were not decorative. They were part of a carefully balanced working system. Victoria kept seeing obstacles where I saw responsibility. She believed appearances created value. I knew value came from understanding what stood quietly beneath the surface. That difference was about to become very expensive. The next week brought the first official notice taped to my mailbox instead of delivered through the postal service. Someone wanted to make sure I saw it before I reached the house. The paper fluttered in the morning breeze. The bold red letters declared an immediate community compliance concern. According to the Homeowners Association, my entrance created a negative visual experience for residents and guests using the golf course. They demanded that I replace the existing barn gates within 14 days. They even included color samples for what they called an appropriate countryside aesthetic. I folded the notice once and slipped it into the same folder as every other letter Victoria had sent. By then the folder had become thick enough that it barely closed. 3 days later, another surprise arrived. I woke before sunrise to the low rumble of heavy equipment somewhere beyond the trees. The sound blended with the familiar hum of irrigation pumps from the golf course. At first I assumed the developers were expanding another fairway. Then one of my ranch hands called. His voice sounded uneasy. He told me strangers were parked near the north entrance. I drove over immediately. 2 pickup trucks sat beside my fence line. A trailer carried compact construction equipment. 4 workers stood near the gates drinking coffee while studying printed diagrams. Victoria stood with them wearing press riding boots that had clearly never touched Rio Ranch mud before that morning. She greeted me with the same practiced smile. She claimed they were performing a neighborhood improvement project. I reminded her she was standing on private property. She answered that the entrance affected community appearance, and therefore required immediate correction. I asked whether she had a county permit. She changed the subject. I asked whether she had written permission from the property owner. She smiled again and said the board had already approved everything that mattered. That sentence stayed with me. Everything that mattered. She genuinely believed a board vote inside a clubhouse could replace ownership. I looked at the workers instead of arguing with her. Most avoided eye contact. One quietly packed away his coffee cup as though he already regretted accepting the job. I told them they should verify the property records before touching anything. Victoria interrupted before anyone could answer. She instructed the crew to continue measuring while I was still standing there. I could hear tape measures snapping against the wooden posts. I could smell fresh gasoline from the idle machinery. The bison lifted their heads in the distance. They were already watching the unusual activity. Animals notice changes long before people do. I took photographs from every angle. I recorded the license plates on every truck. I documented the names printed on every company shirt. Victoria laughed softly and asked whether I planned to post the pictures on social media. I simply replied that records become valuable when memories suddenly change. She rolled her eyes. 2 mornings later I left before daylight to inspect a water line on the southern pasture. The repair took longer than expected because a valve housing had shifted after recent rain. When I returned just after sunrise, the smell of fresh splintered oak drifted across the driveway before I even reached the entrance. The gates were gone. Heavy chain links lay coiled in the grass. The hinges had been removed cleanly. Tire marks crossed the soft ground where equipment had entered and exited during the night. The opening stretched nearly 20 feet wide without a single barrier remaining. Beyond it, the first curious bison had already wandered closer than usual. Across the valley I could hear distant applause from the golf course as players began another perfect morning. Nobody over there realized that one careless decision made for appearances had quietly erased the only boundary keeping 2 completely different worlds peacefully separated. Most people expected me to explode with anger. That was exactly what Victoria wanted. She wanted a loud argument in front of witnesses. She wanted photographs of the stubborn rancher refusing progress. She wanted another story to tell at the next homeowners association meeting. Instead, I walked slowly across the empty entrance and picked up every broken hinge one at a time. The cold steel still held the smell of fresh machine oil where someone had removed the bolts only hours earlier. I placed each piece inside the bed of my truck. Then I photographed every tire track before the morning sun dried the soft soil. I measured the distance between the equipment marks. I collected splinters from the shattered gateposts. Nothing was too small. Details have a way of becoming very expensive later. My ranch manager, Caleb, pulled beside me in an aging diesel pickup. He looked at the opening and shook his head. He asked if we should start building temporary fencing before the herd wandered north. I told him not yet. He stared at me for several seconds because that answer made no sense. Every rancher knows an open entrance creates risk. Every instinct told us to close it immediately. But instincts sometimes interfere with evidence. I wanted the scene exactly as the people responsible had left it. I called my attorney before I called the sheriff. That surprised Caleb even more. My attorney answered on the second ring. I gave him only facts. No opinions. No accusations. I described the missing gates. I listed the photographs I had taken. I read the exact wording printed on the Homeowners Association notice. He became quiet for a moment. Then he told me not to repair anything until an independent surveyor completed a full inspection. I thanked him and ended the call. Around noon, 2 county deputies arrived after Wade reported suspicious activity near the property. They walked the entrance with careful expressions. One deputy asked whether I wanted to file immediate criminal charges. I told him I simply wanted everything documented correctly. He nodded and spent nearly an hour taking measurements. Before leaving, he quietly admitted that several homeowners had already complained about the ranch for reasons that sounded more personal than legal. That observation did not surprise me. By late afternoon, Victoria drove past the entrance in her white sport utility vehicle. She slowed just enough for me to notice her satisfied smile before continuing toward the golf course. She believed silence meant surrender. She believed I had accepted defeat because I refused to perform for her audience. She had no idea I was following the advice my father repeated throughout my childhood. Never interrupt someone while they are making a mistake they cannot afford. The bison remained calm through the afternoon because they trusted familiar routines. Feed arrived on schedule. Water tanks stayed full. Ranch hands moved quietly without sudden changes. Even so, I noticed more animals drifting toward the open entrance every hour. Curiosity is natural. A missing barrier changes patterns even when nothing else changes. I instructed everyone to remain alert through the night. We positioned additional trucks nearby without blocking the opening. We watched. We waited. Across the valley, music drifted from the clubhouse patio as golfers celebrated another successful weekend tournament. Laughter echoed over the rolling hills. The scent of grilled steaks carried through the evening breeze. Spotlights illuminated perfectly trimmed greens that shimmered like emerald glass beneath the Texas sky. It looked like two completely different worlds separated by only a few hundred yards of grass. One world respected boundaries because survival depended on them. The other believed boundaries were optional if enough people voted against them. Standing beside the empty entrance, I realized Victoria had never actually defeated me. She had only removed the one thing quietly protecting everything she valued most. The survey team arrived just after sunrise. Frost still covered the grass. Their measuring equipment clicked softly as they worked around the empty entrance. Nobody hurried. Nobody guessed. Every photograph carried a timestamp. Every measurement went into an official report. By noon, my attorney called again. His voice sounded different this time. Calm. Interested. He asked one simple question. Had anyone from the Homeowners Association asked permission before entering the ranch? I answered exactly as I had before. No. He told me to keep every document because the situation had become much larger than missing gates. That afternoon, I unlocked a filing cabinet inside my office that almost nobody had ever seen. The drawers smelled faintly of old paper and cedar. Inside were property surveys dating back more than 60 years. Federal conservation agreements. Environmental management plans. Veterinary certifications. Water rights. Easements. Boundary maps. My grandfather believed paperwork deserved as much care as livestock. I spent the next several hours laying every document across the conference table. Piece by piece, the entire picture came back together. The northern pasture was not ordinary grazing land. It formed part of a registered conservation corridor connecting protected habitat across several neighboring ranches. The entrance Victoria ordered removed was identified by name inside multiple management agreements. It controlled seasonal movement for one of the largest privately managed American bison conservation herds in the region. Removing it without authorization violated far more than property rights. It interfered with protected land management practices that existed decades before Blackstone Ridge was even imagined. My attorney arrived before sunset carrying another stack of records from the county courthouse. We compared every page. Every legal description matched perfectly. Then he smiled for the first time since this whole situation began. He pointed toward a single paragraph buried inside an easement agreement signed nearly 30 years earlier. It clearly stated that any unauthorized alteration affecting livestock containment inside the conservation corridor transferred full civil responsibility for resulting property damage to the party performing or directing the alteration. He tapped the page twice with his pen. Then he quietly said that someone on the Homeowners Association board had just made the most expensive landscaping decision of their lives. Even then, I did not fully appreciate how right he was. Meanwhile, life continued across the valley. Golf tournaments filled the weekend schedule. Luxury homes hosted outdoor parties beneath string lights. Promotional drones filmed sweeping videos of perfect fairways and peaceful country scenery. Ironically, many of those aerial shots included my ranch stretching across the horizon. They advertised the natural landscape while treating the people maintaining it like an inconvenience. Late that evening, Caleb joined me on the porch overlooking the northern pasture. We watched the herd drifting closer to the open entrance as the last sunlight faded behind the hills. The air smelled of dry grass and distant cedar smoke. Every few minutes another bison wandered near the missing gates before calmly turning back toward fresh hay. Caleb finally broke the silence. He asked whether we should tell the Homeowners Association what those documents actually meant. I looked across the valley where clubhouse lights reflected off polished windows. I could hear faint applause after another tournament finished. I slowly folded the easement agreement and placed it back inside the folder. Then I answered with the only response that made sense. They never asked before making their decision. They clearly believed they already understood everything. Sometimes the fastest way to teach respect is to let arrogance finish writing its own ending. The following morning began with complete silence. No engines. No construction crews. Even the golf course seemed unusually peaceful beneath a pale blue sky. Thin fog drifted across the fairways while the smell of fresh coffee floated from the clubhouse patio. From my porch the neighborhood looked exactly like the brochures Victoria loved handing to new buyers. Perfect lawns. Perfect houses. Perfect confidence. I spent the morning inside my office instead of writing fence lines. My attorney returned carrying another leather binder that looked older than both of us. He placed it on the table without saying a word. Inside were corporate ownership records that almost nobody outside my accountants had ever seen. I had never hidden them. I had simply never volunteered the information because nobody had ever asked the right questions. Blackstone Ridge residents assumed I was fortunate enough to inherit a ranch. The truth stretched far beyond that assumption. My family had quietly built Brooks Land and Water Holdings over 3 generations. We never chased headlines. We never sponsored stadiums. We invested in land, infrastructure, conservation, and long-term leases. One acquisition at a time. One agreement at a time. We owned thousands of surrounding acres that developers considered unimportant because they could not build houses on them. We purchased watershed easements, access roads, utility corridors, retention ponds, emergency service routes, grazing leases, water distribution rights. None of those assets attracted attention until somebody suddenly needed them. My attorney spread several maps across the table. Colored lines crossed the valley in every direction. Blue represented water infrastructure. Green represented conservation land. Yellow marked transportation easements. Nearly every line eventually connected through property controlled by my company. The golf course itself belonged to a separate development corporation. Their luxury neighborhood looked independent on paper. In reality, many of the services supporting it crossed land we owned under carefully negotiated agreements signed years before Victoria ever became Homeowners Association president. She had spent months talking about controlling the neighborhood. She never realized she had been standing inside a system built on contracts she had never bothered to read. My attorney smiled again. He said the insurance companies would soon request every maintenance record connected to the destroyed entrance. Environmental agencies would examine the conservation agreements. Civil investigators would review trespass claims. Corporate lawyers representing the golf course investors would demand answers about unauthorized work performed without owner approval. Every road pointed toward the same decision made by one board meeting obsessed with appearances. That afternoon I drove into town for supplies exactly as I always did. Nobody recognized anything unusual. Victoria happened to be leaving a real estate office carrying folders beneath one arm. She waved cheerfully as though nothing had happened. She even thanked me for remaining cooperative throughout the improvement process. I simply wished her a pleasant afternoon. She interpreted calmness as surrender once again. She had no reason to think otherwise. People who live inside comfortable illusions rarely notice the foundation beginning to crack beneath them. When I returned to the ranch, Caleb met me beside the northern pasture. He watched me unload fencing tools that I never used. Finally, he asked the question everyone around me seemed afraid to ask. Why had I never told anyone who actually owned everything surrounding Blackstone Ridge? I looked across the hills where evening sunlight reflected off rows of expensive windows. Then I answered honestly. Real ownership does not need to announce itself every morning. It simply waits until someone mistakes patience for weakness. Somewhere beyond the ridge a golf cart rolled across freshly cut grass. A sprinkler system began its familiar evening rhythm. The neighborhood settled into another peaceful sunset, completely unaware that every document necessary to reshape its future was already sitting inside a quiet office on my ranch. The disaster began on a quiet Saturday morning that looked almost too perfect to be real. Sunlight spilled across the rolling hills. Freshly cut grass filled the air with its sweet, earthy smell. The golf course was hosting its annual charity invitational. Luxury sport utility vehicles lined the parking lot. Television crews filmed opening interviews beside the clubhouse. Realtors greeted investors with polished smiles. Victoria stood near the first tee wearing a bright white blazer that practically reflected the morning sun. She looked proud. She believed the neighborhood had finally become everything she imagined. Across the valley, I watched through binoculars from my porch. Caleb stood beside me without saying a word. We both noticed the same thing at exactly the same moment. The lead bison slowly walked toward the missing entrance. Another followed. Then another. There was no panic. No stampede. No chaos. They simply continued following the natural path that had existed for generations before someone removed the only barrier guiding them elsewhere. Within minutes, dozens of animals wandered through the open gap and drifted onto the wide stretches of perfectly irrigated grass beyond my property line. The rich green fairways looked exactly like fresh pasture after a spring rain. To the herd, it was simply another grazing field. Golf carts stopped moving almost immediately. Players lowered their clubs and backed away with surprised expressions. Event staff began directing guests toward the clubhouse. Security vehicles rolled across the cart paths but wisely kept their distance. Nobody wanted to frighten several hundred massive protected animals into unpredictable movement. The tournament ended before the second group finished the opening hole. Television cameras captured everything. Helicopter footage showed the enormous herd spreading across multiple fairways while wildlife officers calmly established safety zones around the property. News alerts spread across the state within an hour. Investors canceled scheduled property tours. Wedding events booked for the clubhouse were postponed indefinitely. By lunchtime, every entrance road leading into Blackstone Ridge was filled with county officials, wildlife specialists, insurance representatives, and environmental investigators. Then the paperwork avalanche began. The county survey confirmed the gates had been removed without authorization. Wildlife officers documented that the herd had simply followed an artificial opening created by unauthorized construction activity. Insurance adjusters photographed every damaged section of landscaping, irrigation equipment, decorative fencing, golf carts, and ornamental gardens. Their preliminary report carried one sentence that changed everything. The initiating cause originated from unauthorized alteration of private livestock containment infrastructure performed without owner consent. My attorney forwarded copies of the conservation agreements before sunset. Environmental agencies opened formal investigations. Corporate attorneys representing the golf course demanded every homeowners association meeting record related to the landscaping project. Contractors who removed the gates admitted they acted under written instructions from Victoria and the board. The insurance carrier reviewed those statements for less than 2 days before issuing its decision. Coverage was denied because the damages resulted from intentional unauthorized work rather than an accidental event. The estimated financial loss climbed into the millions before the first week ended. These included emergency landscaping contracts, tournament cancellations, property value disputes, investor withdrawals, and soaring legal defense costs. Homeowners began receiving special assessment notices larger than many annual mortgage payments. Board meetings that once celebrated community beautification turned into crowded rooms filled with angry residents demanding answers. Victoria no longer walked through the clubhouse with confident speeches. She arrived surrounded by attorneys carrying thick binders instead of glossy brochures. From my porch, the valley looked almost unchanged. The sun still set behind the same hills. The wind still carried the smell of cedar and fresh grass. The only difference was that one missing pair of barn gates had quietly exposed how fragile an empire built on arrogance had always been. 3 months later, the valley looked different. Not because the hills had changed. Nature rarely changes for human pride. The difference was that people had finally learned to respect what had always been there. The legal process moved quietly after the headlines faded. Court filings replaced neighborhood gossip. Depositions replaced board meetings. Every contractor confirmed the same sequence of events. Every email pointed toward the same Decision. Every photograph matched the survey reports. Nobody could argue with the timeline because Victoria and the Homeowners Association had documented most of it themselves. The insurance denial remained in place. The Development Corporation settled multiple claims with homeowners. Investors withdrew from future expansion projects. Several board members resigned before the final hearings even began. Victoria spent months insisting she acted for the good of the community. The judge asked only one question that mattered. Did you have permission from the property owner? The courtroom became very quiet after that. Eventually, the remaining Homeowners Association voted to dissolve its authority and transfer community management to the county. Residents were simply exhausted. They wanted stability instead of endless legal bills. The golf course closed for a complete redesign after the financial losses became impossible to ignore. When the property finally entered receivership, my company submitted a bid along with several investment groups. Ours was accepted because we already owned the surrounding infrastructure and conservation easements. The closing took less than an hour. After years of conflict, the entire golf course officially became part of Brooks Land and Water Holdings. Caleb laughed when he saw the signed paperwork. He reminded me that Victoria once offered to replace my barn gates with decorative stone arches. Now the land surrounding those missing gates belonged to the same company she had spent months trying to pressure. The first project we completed was surprisingly simple. We rebuilt the entrance exactly as my grandfather designed it. Solid oak. Heavy steel hinges. Hand-forged hardware. Strong enough to last another 40 years. Wildlife specialists helped us improve the surrounding conservation corridor without changing its original purpose. We planted native grasses where ornamental landscaping once struggled to survive. The old clubhouse became a conservation education center where local schools now visit every spring. Children stand safely behind observation fences while learning why healthy ecosystems depend on respecting natural boundaries. Instead of forcing everything to match a brochure. Even many former Blackstone Ridge residents volunteer there today. They often tell visitors the valley taught them an expensive lesson about ownership and responsibility. One cool autumn evening, I stood beside the rebuilt gates as the sun disappeared behind the western hills. The bison grazed peacefully across the pasture exactly as they had when my grandfather first brought them here. The air smelled of cedar, dry grass, and fresh rain moving in from the north. The valley felt quiet again. Caleb asked whether I ever regretted staying silent for so long. I looked across the land that 3 generations of my family had protected and slowly shook my head. Anger would have changed nothing. Patience revealed everything. Victoria believed power came from titles, committees, and carefully written notices. She never understood that real authority begins with responsibility and ends with accountability. She removed a pair of gates because she thought they spoiled the view. What she actually removed was the only barrier protecting the illusion that she controlled this valley. Justice never needed to shout across the hills. It simply waited for arrogance to open the wrong gate.